that was so interesting about Indebted was the way in which you captured the sense of aspiration that the middle class parents have for their kids. And yeah, I was just wondering how you drew that out. Did you know that you should be looking for that? Or, I'm familiar with some of that, obviously, from being like at an elite school where people are educated to attend those kind of places and whatnot. But there was this segment of the population that you were looking at that had those aspirations, but they weren't couched in the same way that they would for someone who's growing up on Fifth Avenue or something, who...
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
For most of the families that I spoke with, who are all broadly middle class, which I define as being too wealthy or having too much income to qualify for Pell Grants, but also not being able to pay cash. Right. That sense of aspiration is really critical to their identity as middle class people. Being middle class has for so long been identified with opening an opportunity for children,
right,
and creating the possibility that children could move beyond their parents' stations, whether that meant having a greater income or being able to participate more fully in their communities. And so unearthing the sense of aspiration was in some ways not very difficult because it was always right at the surface for those families. So once I made the decision to interview parents and students in the same families, those issues came right to the surface.
Yeah, and I did wonder, maybe this is the academic in me, and maybe it's also teaching at CUNY, but at some points in time when I was reading, I was like, why don't you just go to like a, reasonably priced public university, especially when kids, they're making these huge sacrifices to so many areas of their lives to live a kind of dream or a fantasy of what this particular kind of institution is going to be like, as opposed to a more perhaps reasonably priced public university. And I wasn't sure exactly, I think, as a philosopher, how to think about that. Are they just kind of buying into some ideas that if they got rid of those ideas they would be much better off, or is this something there that we actually should be responsive to?
Yeah. Well, so I wonder if your position at CUNY in some ways informs that question, because CUNY remains a very affordable university. True, and actually even the State University of New York is a lower price state university than many state universities across the country.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
Actually, for many middle class families, the differences between what you have to pay for public higher education and what you have to pay for private higher education are less than you might think.
I see, right?
Because at the privates, they rarely pay sticker price. They get scholarships of various kinds. That is a real distinction that we organize our ideas around. That there are state schools and private schools.
Right.
When actually, from the perspective of these middle class families, that distinction isn't necessarily as big as we might believe, either in terms of finance or in terms of thinking about what the offerings.
Yeah. I guess I was wondering about some of the students, so some of the families. I was thinking of the family that one of the families who really was keen on sending their child to NYU, and then the other one to Howard. It seemed like they were thinking about these universities as more than just offering a good undergraduate education, but being tied to all of this other aspirational language that I was wondering what where that was coming from in a way.
Yeah, I think that the family whose son goes to Howard, the Gates family, are an interesting case because the mother and father both had attended Mississippi Valley State University, which is a historically black college in the Delta region of Mississippi. The mother, Ramona, herself grew up very poor in nearby Clarksdale, and the father grew up working class in another part of the state. But Valley, as it's known in the area, was really their stepping stone. They saw it as aspirational. Their parents saw that getting them to Valley as being the way out, and that their parents worked very hard to make that happen. And they themselves understood that legacy to be part of their own responsibility to their sons. So they moved from Mississippi then after graduation to Columbus and raised their two boys there with the idea that the boys would themselves go on to better things than the parents. So when their talented son Stanley, who is also older, had the opportunity to go to Howard, this was a fulfillment of their mobility dream. So the institutions really do stand in for so much more than the kind of education that you can get in a classroom.
Right.
I mean, especially at a place like Howard, where the students call it the Mecca. I mean, that name really, I think, captures how much Howard represents to African American young people as a kind of crucible of Black intellectual life.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. It is interesting, though, that the parents see part of their obligation as giving their kids something better, even when that means not, I guess what I'm saying is like, not just giving their kids an education, but giving them a better education where that's understood to the level of a better institution, not just a college degree.
That's right. Yes, right. A better institution or an institution that is going to give them access to kind of a wider range of possibilities.
Right.
And the Gates family definitely saw Howard as representing that, the kind of expanded choices that they wanted Stanley to have. And it worked out that way too.
Right.
So it isn't happening in a vacuum, The Gates family knew very intimately the landscape of historically Black colleges and universities. They actually used to hire a bus every summer and drive with 20 youth from their Columbus church mostly around to the HBCUs in the southeast of the United States. They had literally set foot on the campus of every HBCU.
Wow. Yeah.
So they knew what they were looking at when they got to Howard, and they really understood it to be special, and especially special for Stanley, who was always interested in politics and who during his years at Howard brought presidential candidates to campus, ended up working for a senator back home in Ohio, and is now working for a city council person as a kind of first step in his career. Yeah. So it worked out. I mean, it worked out for Stanley. He still carries quite a lot of debt, and so do his parents. So the issue isn't are they getting the ideas, or the issue to me
Yeah.
is not, are they getting the ideas wrong?
Right.
They're actually getting them pretty correct. It's that the system we operate under forces a compromise.
Right.
And this is, I thought, a really interesting parallel in our books, is that,
Yeah.
I see this as being a real, that parents and students alike have to operate within a moral conflict between their sense of responsibility that they have to operate within financial constraint, and their sense of their responsibility to open a future for their children, for young people, at any cost. And so that conflict places parents especially in a really, really difficult situation, and they more often than not become kind of willing to sacrifice their own futures and their own stability in order to create the opportunity for their kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's what I thought was interesting, because the way that I think about the students I focus on, strivers, and I define that as first generation and low-income students who are seeking upward mobility through education, I think of strivers as having to make trade-offs in the pursuit of higher education that they shouldn't have to make, right? That often strivers will bear the burden of playing roles like providing childcare or elder care or working full-time to support their families, because they come from families that are low income. They really depend on the college-age children they have to, support the family in some way. And so the way I think about it is that those trade-offs are unjust, in part because the strivers are bearing the burden that should go on the safety net in some way that is constantly being eroded in this country. But then the example of the middle class parents is a little bit harder for me to think about, because some of it has to do with this constant aspiring for something better, right? So it's not that you can't, or maybe in some cases you can't get a good public education for your kids and not make these huge sacrifices. But that in some cases it's the wanting a better education than the one you had that is the driving force. And that's a little trickier for me to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were talking, I think, about the kind of deep irony at the heart of your book, which is that parents have bought into this idea of independent flourishing for their students, and they're trying to do everything they can to cultivate that and to cultivate students living up to that. And so I guess to some extent strategically trying to get their children not to be too connected to their families, perhaps their communities, depending on the details of the case, so that they can go off and pursue. But then at the same time, they're going to become so interdependent financially and interdependent with the broader financial system through that. So I was just saying, I was the first person in my family to go to college, and I was actually lucky in that I had an extended family member that was able to pay for for the bit of the college that Princeton didn't pay for, but Princeton gave me very generous aid. And my husband has a bunch of student debt, but his parents bought him out. They bought the debt from whoever the lender was, and then he pays them and they're retired now, so he basically contributes to their retirement by paying them with like a very minor amount of interest, but they thought of it as an investment to pay off his debt and then be able to count on him as an adult to pay them back while they're retiring, which makes a lot of sense.
It does.
But when he first told me about it, because I think I grew up in a much more interdependent kind of culture of reciprocity. I'm like, if they could just pay off your loans, why didn't they just pay for your schooling? Like, it just the logic of it, But now I see that they had a very rational strategy. They both have PhDs, so it kind of makes sense.
Right.
But there is this very different way, I think, of thinking about the sacrifices that families make and the amount of reciprocity involved.
Mm-hmm.
If you come from a working class family where I think it's you help as much as you can, but all of that help is kind of explicit, and people will talk about it, and this is like we're all sacrificing for, as opposed to trying to have this image of independence, or this ideal of independence, and maybe hiding some aspects of what's really going on financially, so that you can feel like you're the model of independence that you're after is in place, even though underneath it isn't.
Right. Well, they're sort of mirror images. In some way, because in your book, when students do sort of kind of cross a line, and a line meaning like into a different kind of institutional location
mm-hmm.
than their parents would have access to, the college.
Yeah.
That step into independence then creates its own tension.
Right.
So, what do you think are the most important parts of that for students? What do they feel most critically?
Yeah. So one interesting aspect of thinking about how students think about their independence from their families and parents is that I think they're genuinely torn, right? Because on the one hand, and maybe this ties into what you talk about in your book, but they see this notion that they're not tied to their families and that they have no obligation to their families, that they should cultivate independence from families as an imposition on their understanding of the world, right? Something that they're not quite sure they buy.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they are, most of them, in college to pursue their own individual flourishing, and they want to succeed at doing that. And so I think often they feel torn between seeing that the smart thing to do is to start to separate a bit from their families and their communities and invest more in their own education, but then feeling like that is going against some deeply held cultural values that they hold.
Cultural, but also important, really economic and social values,
yeah.
because the labor they provide is actual support. It helps the family run. It helps by a contribution of money. It helps buy groceries, or
yeah.
it helps navigate the medical system. It's far beyond a kind of just a cultural understanding.
No, that's true. And one difference, I think, too, that a lot of the parents in your book have a college education, and that's how they're middle class, or that's part of what's enabled them to attain the status they have. And so perhaps in a way they have a sense of what's possible that they transmit to their children, that at least with my students, sometimes I think that they don't realize that not every college student works as hard as they do, or they've sort of accepted the situation they're in. So for example, this semester I have a student who's coming back to college, works 2 jobs, which amounts to full-time, has a kid going into middle school, and is a full-time college student, and basically doesn't sleep or do anything else but these 3 things. And also provide support for his mother, whose landlord is trying to kick her out of public housing, so he's going to lawyers and doing all this stuff. And I was talking to him because he had missed a few assignments, and he was telling me a little bit about what was going on, and he was just like, yeah, I'll get back on it. I'm sorry, professor. You know, I've been doing this for a few years, so I'm used to it. And it's kind of this sort of acceptance that this is the way things are. This is the way you move forward. And I think not really, I'm sure if he thought about it, he'd have a sense that other people don't have to make as huge a sacrifice, but that other people are going to college under such different conditions with so much more freedom as to how they can use that time and how much time they can invest in classes. And that to me is kind of striking, right? That part of the job that parents do to cultivate this independence is to some extent they know what's possible and are trying to give their kids that. Whereas some of the parents, I think that of the strivers that I interviewed and some of the students I teach don't really have a sense of that, right? They think that it kind of extreme, going to school full time, working full time, dealing with doing all this stuff to your family, and they're like, that's how you get ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think that what you're describing is really the conditions of aspiration in the United States today. And of course, if you have a lower income and you come from a community that has been systematically denied resources, where the only option is to get out to move up, then there is a sense that it is your burden, or it makes sense that people students who come from those places feel that they have to carry that burden, and for middle class students, that there isn't that idea. That the idea is still that the future is promising and open, and in some cases the parents are holding that open with every muscle in their body. I mean, they're trying to make sure that it doesn't close.
So the parents are shouldering the burden in a way.
The parents shoulder the burden. Yeah. But yes, middle class students are middle class in part because they have this idea that their potential is something that should be honored and that will receive recognition, whereas it sounds like the student that you're describing, he's the only one that is going to kind of make it happen,
right?
And he sounds like he accepts that burden. And so one really interesting part of your book was your insistence that students who are upwardly mobile need to reflect on their choices and on the ethical costs that they bear. So how would you describe that in terms of that student?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like he's trying to do it all and not quite, not incur any costs. But most of the students in your book, except the cost he's incurring is his own sanity and health.
Yeah.
But most of the students have, they confront the cost within their relationships.
Yeah, so I think that part of the kind of being more reflective, and I think understanding the social structures and the financial system within which students are operating comes, I think the motivation to do that is really also motivation to understand that their choices are not reflective only of who they are as people. And so, it ties to the idea that you talk about a potential, where what I see with some of my students, including the student that came in to talk to me, is that he'll think, I'm not doing well in this class, I'm kind of failing at this, or his son was having some problem at school and he felt so bad, like he wasn't being a good dad, and so a lot of the a lot of the consequences of the choices he was making were ones that he wasn't happy with, and he was taking all the blame himself. And so I think reflecting a little bit on the situation in which you're in and the way in which it depends on these social structures, financial incentives, and also that not everybody is in that kind of situation and has the freedom to, spend more hours working on a paper and to find the time to hang out with their kid who's having problems at school. I think that can offer students some perspective on their own choices so that they don't internalize the consequences of those choices as just reflecting something about who they are and their character. And I think also just being a little bit more mindful about resisting some of the ways in which there is pressure around them to give up on things and aspects of their lives that they value. So, in the book, I talked to this young woman who was getting her MBA and policy degree at Harvard, and she had come from a working class family. They'd been in food stamps, and she really just, shot up the ladder of upward mobility. And what I thought was so interesting about her was that she had this very clear sense of the value her family and her community had for her, and that as she was getting pushed by classmates who were from different socioeconomic backgrounds to detach herself from her family, to not see herself as obligated to her family, she had a way of pushing back against that, of saying, no, this is who I am, this is what I value, this is really important to my identity, and so no, I'm not going to go on vacation to Iceland instead of giving that money to my mom who needs it, or
Right.
and so I think there is a way in which I think being more reflective allows you to notice when you might be sacrificing on something that you don't want to be sacrificing on, and also to contextualize your choices as not simply reflecting something about you and your character, that they really are conditioned by the circumstances, which as anthropologists and sociologists, of course, that's the bread and butter. But I think for many students, that's sort of a new thought.
Yes, it is. I mean, and it is certainly. I mean, that is also true for the middle class families that I worked with. The sense that they are to blame for their economic fragility and for their struggle to pay for school and for the compromises that parents are making in their own long-term security is incredibly strong. That sense of personal responsibility for their circumstances, and so much of what they're willing to do for their kids is to make sure that they don't transmit that, or to try to block their children from having to suffer from what they feel they've just to suffer from the choices they feel that they've made badly. So that I think that is that's quite a parallel. And yes, I would love that sense of needing to reflect, to have a real of building an ethical identity that includes a recognition that any individual is not to blame for their situation entirely, is incredibly important. So one of the things that I was wondering about your book too was how you felt like students or anyone really could access that reflection and could start to build that identity, that kind of ethically responsive identity that you're hoping they will.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question in a way, because as a philosopher, I'm like, well, you got to think about your values and reflect on that. But of course, I think, there are two parts to it. I think within college, there's definitely, I think, a reluctance by some students to really engage in thinking reflectively about their own values and their own ethics. And I think that's one place where we could push students to do some of that work. But even before they get to college, I think that students are often not allowed to do a lot of reflection on their own values and their own goals and think about how all of those things are supposed to hang together in their lives. So one of the classes I teach sometimes is philosophy of education, and I'll do stuff on higher education, and ask students to think about things like, why are you in college? Why does college have requirements? Like, what are the requirements for? Just different aspects of the enterprise they're involved in. And almost none of them have ever thought about that question. Mm-hmm. Even though they're paying all this money, or their families are paying all this money, they get to college and they don't really have a sense of exactly why they're supposed to be there, or what they're supposed to be getting out of it. So I think that is a big failure in the educational system, that somehow we've made college the de facto path to a certain kind of life. And then there's this kind of almost like schizophrenic way that we talk about college as a way to financial stability, and also so it's supposed to have all these intrinsic benefits, that an education is supposed to give, and you're supposed to become a certain sort of person and develop your talents and your potential. And I think students are often really confused by all of these different messages they get, but they're not giving us space to really think through that critically and reflectively, so that they have a better sense of why they themselves individually are there and what they're hoping to get out of it.
Yeah. Well, everything that you've just described is about how education can work to help a young adult kind of transform themselves into the person that they want to be, or even an older adult, because I imagine many of the students in the CUNY system are not in the sort of 18 to 22 year old range. They're older students. There are lots of different kinds of students, and education should do that for anyone, of course. But education also fits into this bigger political story that we have about kind of like, what is education for? Is education to essentially train workers to serve corporate America, or is education for training students to participate democratically? Mm-hmm. And those two goals are always at play in every college or university, and in many ways in every classroom too. Of course, we're encouraged to put like learning outcomes on the syllabus so that they can then write them on CVs.
Right.
So even if as instructors we hold those goals of self-transformation and kind of democratic participation at the forefront of our minds and our pedagogy, that pressure from, well, you're really doing this to get a job always exists. So so I think that like one of the kinds of ethical conflicts that exists kind of for all of our students is navigating through that course, through those pressures to get an education, to get a job, and to get an education that will actually satisfy the need for ethical reflection and for democratic participation that is a critical inheritance of higher education.
Yeah, and in a way, the more and more families and students have to pay and sacrifice to get higher education, the more I think it's incumbent upon us to justify ourselves and our, what we're doing in the classroom and what we're doing within the university to those parents and those families. So I haven't been moved. Sometimes, we'll have students that want to know, why should I take philosophy? Which is a requirement at City College. This is not going to help me in my life. And some of my colleagues will say things like, well, it's part of being a well-educated person, or, these ideas are inherently valuable, which sure, I believe both of those things. But I think when you have someone sacrificing so much, is that really your answer for...
Well, I think that the cost of higher education renders those arguments more and more difficult to make. Not because they're any less true than they were before, but because the pressure to pay back loans is so very great that students and parents alike are necessarily focused on it. It's really pitting one kind of freedom against another, because debt and the necessity to pay it back is a kind of unfreedom. You have to pay it back. You are going to get a monthly statement that requires you to send your loan servicer that several $100s that they require, or else there are penalties. Their interest rates go up, or your bottom line increases because of interest rates, and so wanting to be able to pay down the debt is about wanting freedom. It's about wanting independence, and it pits a kind of instrumental education against the kind of education that students might get in a philosophy class or an anthropology class or a sociology class that isn't instrumental. That's a different kind of freedom. But it's a prospective freedom. It's a freedom about who you're going to be in the world. And it's a kind of freedom that will allow you or not really allow, but will help deepen your engagement with your community and your ability to sort of see a way forward. That's a different kind of freedom, and it isn't. I don't know. The conflict is a very powerful one, and students and parents both feel it.
Yeah. I thought that was an interesting aspect of some of the families you talked to, or a feature that many of them were so focused on the potential that their children could develop within the context of higher education. And they thought about it, it seemed in many cases, very non-instrumentally, despite the fact that most of the public discourse around higher education has rendered it an instrumental kind of education. And I thought that was interesting. Like, the parents hadn't fully bought onto that.
The parents in my study don't fully buy that education should be instrumental. And it shouldn't be such a mystery, because they love their kids. They love their kids as full human beings. They see the person in front of them as, someone who is becoming, and who has so much more to do and so many more ways to grow. I mean, this is what a parent's relationship with their child is. And the idea that higher education is just supposed to be funneling somebody into a job is such a terribly, terribly narrow way of looking at it. And I think that it is one we should an argument that we should encounter with a good deal of suspicion, because it seems much more political than it does really really grappling with the very the depth of what education can do.
Yeah, and it did make me wonder. So all of these articles that get written about the cost of higher education that focus on education in that way, who are they written for? Because it seems like these parents are not.
Oh, they're not reading them.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I would always, in my interviews, I would always ask, what kind of financial help do you seek, or like, are you reading the newspaper about college costs or finances? People just generally did not read those things.
Uh-huh.
And it's not. I mean, I read those things,
right?
But I think that it isn't necessarily true that parents are looking to these big policy voices or I don't know, news reports for guidance. They're looking at the kid in front of them,
mm-hmm.
and they're talking to their neighbors,
right? Yeah,
and and other parents at school or at church, or that's. I mean, one of the things that is so frustrating about the situation that we put all families and low income and middle income together. Is that we have this idea that they should have these like very long-term goals. They should be making making decisions for like many years out.
Mm-hmm.
But families make decisions best with what is around them, and oftentimes those are the issues that feel most urgent. Not saving money so that my kid can go to college 18 years out, but getting my kid, who is now 8, into a grade school
right.
that will support his education right now, and maybe that means paying more in rent or paying a higher mortgage, or signing up with signing up for school through a cousin's place who happens to live across a neighborhood line.
Right.
Those are the kinds of decisions that feel most pressing to parents. And so asking them to do this kind of long-range planning, which you can only do if you're very wealthy, frankly,
right.
Is a distorted policy goal.
No, I agree. And it is... I think you touch a little bit on the movement for free higher education, and the way that it gets criticized, that you're subsidizing the education of better off families, because in fact lots of low-income families don't even go to public colleges, et cetera, right? And I do think that one thing that your book shows is the amount of work and labor and stress and worry that goes into making ends meet with the current system that we have. So even those families that somehow figure it out and they're able to send their kid to Howard by pulling all these resources and sacrificing, and I mean, it just seems like such a highly inefficient system to think that doing it that way is the way that we should do it.
It does seem ridiculously efficient, and it also presents a very distorted picture of what it means to aspire to something. So you teach at City College. My stepfather went to City College in the he passed a while ago. He was very elderly.
When it was free.
So free, in the 1940s.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I found it more recently than not. So my stepfather went to City College in the 1940s, and he was a poor kid from the Bronx, from a family that was not terribly supportive of his education or his love of school. But City College was there for him clearly as a possibility that he could do with or without his family.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was free was a huge deal. It was a huge deal because it meant it was for him. It wasn't necessarily for them. It didn't require his parents. It's the fact that it was free was a really important condition of his aspiration.
Yeah. And I think that part of the argument about free public education really gets missed, that it would enable students to feel like it's the thing they're doing. It's an autonomous choice. And of course, families have to figure out how to pay for housing, or the student themselves would have to figure out how to pay for housing or whatever. But that's, I think, it just is a very different thing than trying to cobble together tuition and having families, it seems like, put their retirement on the line and go into so much debt, and then still feeling like they maybe didn't do enough because their child now has all this debt too.
Right, or that no matter how much they do, like with your student who has a child and a full-time job and a mother with medical needs, that those extraordinary measures are what's required.
Yeah,
that is an imposition on students that will never cease to amaze me.
Yeah,
and I feel like this is kind of like the end of the arc, but one of the one issue about higher education that always surprises me is how much focus we have on higher education as a place where redistribution is supposed to happen. Mm-hmm. So that argument that, well, if we make free tuition, it's really subsidizing upper middle class people, and that really what we should be doing is means testing everything and like sort of funneling it to the lowest to the lowest earners, only looks at the internal dynamics of higher education itself.
Yeah.
Where I think that what higher education should do is educate people.
Right.
Redistribution should happen in the taxation system.
Mm-hmm.
So we spend a lot of time talking about the kind of these sort of micro adjustments of fairness that might happen between the first and fourth years of a college education, mm-hmm. Maybe because it is the pinnacle of some false idea of meritocracy we hold so dear.
Right.
But if we had but the taxation system is actually built for redistribution. Yeah. Higher education is built for education.
No, I couldn't agree more.